Thanks, Joss, and thank you for everyone for coming out here in the most appalling heat. I'm very impressed. I thought there would be a lot of empty chairs. So I'm going to be talking about healthy ageing, what it is, and how do we get there. As I've got older, I've become more interested in this area too. So I can see my demographic out there. So, and I'll go through some of the things that's been preying on my mind for the last 10 years and see what you think. And I'm going to leave lots of time for questions at the end because that's how I learn stuff. All right, so I'm quite keen to hear what people think. Now, this is what's happening, and this is a really good news story. So if we look at Australia at the end of the 19th century, a little boy who was born at the end of the 19th century could expect to live to 47 years of age, and a little girl could expect to live all the way to 51 years of age. Now, a little boy who's born today can expect to live to 81 years of age, and a little girl can expect to live to 84 years of age. Now, and around this time, around the 60s, we thought it had plateaued off. So there was this belief that largely that life expectancy had been increased by things like immunisation campaigns against polio and other things, and there wasn't the huge number of children dying from diarrheal illnesses and other things, and tuberculosis had largely been eradicated. So all those things had disappeared, and we thought that we were sort of going to be stuck. But now it keeps on rising. And every decade, Australians almost get to live another 2 years. Or as one of my colleagues pointed out, every week you live, you get another weekend free. Which is not a way to, but Australians love that idea, but So, but if we go to China, which is different, China's a different place to us. Firstly, it didn't pick up till quite late in the piece, until the end of the 20th century. And you see this steep rise that occurred at the end of the 20th century. It's still not quite as good as Australia, but it's not doing badly, and you can see that this life expectancy increase is occurring in China as well, but not to the extent. The important thing to remember there is that China is a developing nation. It's plumb in the middle of the middle income countries. So when we think about this ageing revolution, we don't just think of it in the developed world. We just don't think about it in rich countries. It's throughout the world. Apart from perhaps parts of Africa, but the rest of the world, Asia especially, they're also observing a mammoth ageing issue. Not a problem, an issue. Now, this increase in life expectancy is not inevitable. So this is largely the developed world, and you can see Australia's doing, if you rank the average ages that we can expect to live, Australia's doing pretty well. So we just missed out on the bronze medal. Maybe we could have got equal third there, equal bronze. But look at this developing country with poor outcomes called the US of A. Do you see how they've drifted downwards? Now, there's lots of reasons why that might be happening. One of the things that's happened there is there's been a prescribed medication opiate crisis, which has resulted in a lot of deaths in middle-aged people from opiate drugs largely prescribed rather than illegal. And the other thing that's happening in the US, which anybody who's visited the US will have noticed, an obesity epidemic. And the obesity epidemic has largely affected poor people. So at the end of the 19th century, if you went around the world, poor people were really skinny and rich people were overweight or obese. Go around the world at the end of the 20th century, poor people are obese, at least in the developed world, and rich people are trim and fit and look fantastic. And I'm trying to get there one day. It's not just the US that's changing. The UK seems to have plateaued in their life expectancy, and there's a lot of argument whether they've plateaued or not, but they have. And the reason why they've plateaued is probably because their health services for older people aren't very good. And that might be one of the reasons, because they seem to actually be going backwards in older people. People in their 70s and 80s do not seem to be living longer. In fact, they're living shorter in the UK. So that's one of the reasons that, so there's different things happening around the world. And in Australia, we're still increasing, but we're not doing as well to the rest of the world as we used to. You know, we're not quite leading the way anymore, but we're not going backwards yet either. This is a study from Lopez and colleagues in the Medical Journal of Australia, and just showing that at least in the last period, in the 2003 to 2015 period, we're not doing as well as we might have expected compared to other developed countries. So we're not doing quite as well. Okay, so what are the reasons? So why are we doing this? Why are people living longer? And that's a really interesting question, and we don't really know the answer. About half of it is probably due to things like stopping smoking, people going on blood pressure medications, generally living a slightly healthier lifestyle. And the other half we don't really know. But it does make you think about, well, why do we age in the first place? Why do individuals age? And there's been a lot of theories about this. This is the one that currently I like and seems to have some sway at this moment. This is called the Disposable Soma theory, which sounds a big mouthful. But it starts this way. Aging is not pre-programmed. All that happens is that you accumulate damage throughout life, and that's because the damages that happen to you throughout life are unpredictable, and they will be inevitable. And the damages you get interact with your genetic makeup, and that means that for some people the damages are much more deleterious than others, and others it doesn't seem to affect. The damage is stochastic in type. And the other thing that happens is the body spends quite a lot of energy and ability to repair things. But there is a point where if you spend too much energy repairing things, you don't reproduce your cells or your cells or yourselves. So too much energy spent in looking after your body means you never have children. That's the sort of concept, right? In the animal world, it seems to apply. And if you actually look at the developed world, the more money you make, the less children you have. That's what happens in the countries in the world. So there's a sense here that reproduction is against repair. And that occurs at the genetic level. So people talk about telomeres, the little buffy bits at the end of, the little knobs at the end of the chromosomes, which degrade as you get older. But you can spend a lot of energy and time in your cells trying to make sure that they stay there, but that takes away from the rest of the cellular function. So the rest of the cell doesn't have energy to do other things. So you can see how there's this trade-off. That's the theory. But this means a couple of things. Firstly, you don't end up with a maximum lifespan. It's a bit like the Olympics. You know, everybody keeps on breaking the times. This is what happens with lifespan. It keeps on getting more. It does seem to plateau now, but you know, we're still getting a little bit longer. And that what happens at the end of life is that you lose redundancy and you have this idea of frailty, where you've lost the little edges of your life. You no longer have the energy to repair everything, and things stop being repaired. Now, there's a thing called the Intergenerational Report, which every 3 to 5 years the Treasury produces one. And in there's a lot of stuff which, and I, having read the last 4, There's a lot of stuff in there, but one of the things in there last time, which I was really impressed with, was this idea of trying to model the gains. So the life expectancy I talked to you at the beginning of saying 81 and 84 years of age is based on the mortality at each age now. But we know that that mortality keeps falling. So what would happen if it keeps falling in the next 50 years? Well, firstly, if it keeps falling in the next 50 years, little boys don't live to 81 years who are born now. They live to 92 years of age. And little girls live to 94 years of age. If little boys and girls, if the expected mortality gains that have happened for the last century keep happening, that's what you're assuming, they're just going to keep happening, a little boy, on average, will live to 92 and a little girl will live to 94. Now this is on average. Just think how many, 50% of those women will live past 94 years of age. Just think how many centenarians will be around. Won't it be great? No, some people are nodding their heads. Why not? All right, this is another way of saying it. This is, I like this because this sort of illustrates what happens to me as well. This is 1971. This is a population pyramid of Australia, and you can see how we had mostly children, and we had the pink is girls and the blue is for boys. You can see that we're getting less and less people, in the older age groups, and it's a nice population pyramid. Well, by 2016, there were 24 million people, and Australia was like me. Can you see it's got middle age spread? You see? And look what happens by 2046, where I hope to be. I hope to be one of those figures, but maybe I won't, right? That will be maybe past my life expectancy. If we keep doing what we're doing, there's going to be 36 million people, but look at where all those people are. Relatively few children and lots of older people in their 70s, 80s, 90s. Look at the 90-year-olds, isn't that great? If you're currently a 50-year-old, that's where you want to be, isn't it? Maybe. And people who worry about it, that's Australia, a lot of money, we can cope with this. But some countries will have a much worse problem. This is China. This is one-child policy, right? Look where China is in 2040. Middle age spread, but virtually nobody underneath. Now that's a problem for China, but you can see, and that's a developing country. That's a middle income country. So this is where we are. This is another way, as a geriatrician, this is my business model. If I had to explain this to, if Jerry Harvey saw my business model, he'd be all over me. He's just trying to sell furniture. Look at this, I'm trying to sell medical care for older people. Look at this, it's a fantastic business model. This is the over 85-year-old. See how it's going from roughly around 2% now to 5%. It's wonderful. That's the sort of business model you love, isn't it? Unfortunately, I'll be one of my businesses. And this is the other thing that happens. That as we live longer, the type of diseases that we get are different. So if we can manage to avoid getting cancer and heart disease and strokes, that allows us to get dementia, which predominantly affects older people. And we're very fortunate. So if you can avoid, and that's the whole point of preventing dementia, I might add. The whole point of preventing dementia is so you can die from a stroke or a heart attack or get cancer, you see. Because you're going to die from something, aren't you? Right? So you're going to get one of these things. But if you live long enough, and if you might be lucky enough to die from dementia roughly at 89 years of age, because that's the average age for people dying with dementia. And about half the people with dementia die from the disease, and half the people die with the disease. And that's what happens when you have older people, because well over about 3/4 of the people with dementia in Australia are over the age of 80. So this is a problem that happens as we get older. And the other thing that happens is that we just don't die from things, we become disabled. We become disabled from osteoarthritis, and we lose more years of life. We lose more years of life to disability than to actually just dying, right? So that's the sort of thing that we're looking at, and that's the sort of thing that we try to grapple with. Now, aging well has had a reasonable history, but we've struggled to work out what it is. You know, people can say, so-and-so aged well, but that poor old decrepit person over there doesn't look like he or she's aged well, right? So we get this idea. But it's hard to say, well, what is it that is aging well? So this is one of the first papers. It's from 1987. And this is the idea that most people don't age well, but some people do. Some people age successfully. And they defined it, and I might add that this has actually not stood the test of time. We all look at this paper, but it's not right, okay? And I'll explain why. But this is the idea that it's the idea that successful aging is unusual, and some essential features are the absence of chronic disease and disability, high cognitive and physical function, and active engagement with life. So that's the sort of thing that people have in their mind, isn't it? No major illness, still up and around doing things for yourselves, people not being looked after, and actively engaged with life. I've put the red thing, the active engagement with life, because that brings in the concept that you can be actively engaged with our life virtually no matter how decrepit you are. Right? But we have to change your environment, don't we? Because you can't be actively engaged with life if you're quite decrepit if your environment doesn't support that. Right? So finally, the World Health Organization has started to take an interest in healthy aging. And for a number of reasons, but mainly because worldwide, this is probably the biggest social movement of the 21st century. Now, you can argue about different social movements and what they are and so on. Arguably, the biggest social movement of the 20th century was probably feminism. And looking at my audience, most of you will not disagree with that, right? But that is the social movement of the 20th century, probably was the biggest movement. The female participation in the workforce, the vote, suffragette movement actually was the beginning of the 20th century, the participation of women in all forms, in leadership roles, all that sort of stuff. Now, the biggest social movement of the 21st century will be this ageing, and it's already happening. I said, look at that group of people over the age of 85. Well, they're decrepit and they're not active and they don't do much, right? But what's Mahathir? Didn't he just get elected to Prime Minister of Malaysia at the age of 93? What's Trump? And his opponent, the favourite for his opponent is somebody a bit older than him, right? Do you see that the world is being taken over by older people in many ways? Do you see? The social movement's already happening around us. And so this is happening. So it's probably worth having a think about, well, if this is going to be a large part of our world, how do we actually ensure that those older people age as healthily as possible? And so the the World Health Organization has come up with this concept of healthy aging. And the concept is based on functional ability, and it's divided into three aspects. And it firstly talks about intrinsic capacity, that is what an individual is still capable of doing, right? And then it talks about the environment, and then talks about the interactions between environment and the person. So that's in a nutshell all you have to do. And now you can go home because you've worked it all out, and that's it. Because usually this is when people get tired of me, so you're right, you can switch off now. So that's it. But the World Health Organization has done a little more than that. Now, the first thing is they said that this intrinsic capacity is a quarter is determined by your genes. So like a lot of things in life, it's really important to choose your parents well. Okay? There's a lot of things in life where it's really important that you did that first up. But you'll notice that the World Health Organization says this. I couldn't find the reference. I don't think they've got very good reference, but it feels about right. You know, having some, work in genetic stuff, it feels about right. So about 25%, but that means that 75% is environmentally determined. That means that healthy aging isn't predestined. It's not all how you were born. Right, which is the good news, because otherwise there wouldn't be any point in trying. You might as well just give up. You're just stuck with the genes you were born with, and you're going to live young or old depending on that and how you're healthy. So that's good news. They talk about health-related behaviours, which I'll talk a little bit about. The physiological changes with ageing, slightly. I'll talk about diseases and injuries. I won't talk much at all, and geriatric syndromes. But the really important thing is that there's enormous variation in trajectory across the lifespan. And peak intrinsic capacity, which probably occurs at the end of adolescence, beginning of the 20s, right? So that's when you peak for all things, including cognitive abilities. And then you just have to spend the rest of your life convincing younger people you're not deteriorating, right? That's your job. As you get older, you spend your life convincing young people you're not about to drop off the perch, right? So this is the idea of intrinsic capacity. And the World Health Organization decided that these were the important things, and I think they're probably right. But that we haven't worked out exactly how we're going to measure it and what we're going to do about it, but this is sort of basically the idea. That firstly, there's a sense of vitality, which is often associated with nutrition, the energy you have to do things. Your locomotor ability, your ability to get around and move, run, jump, whatever. Your psychological capacity, and here we're thinking of not having bad things like anxiety or depression, but also having confidence and resilience, if you want the yin and yang between the two. Here we're talking about cognitive capacity, your ability to think, solve problems, those sort of issues. And then the special senses get a special look in visual capacity and hearing capacity. And this is the idea that your functional ability goes down with age and time, but your intrinsic capacity might change quite dramatically. For example, if you have a stroke, off you go, down your intrinsic capacity has fallen quite quickly. And there seems to be this gradual change as you get older of both your intrinsic capacity and your functional ability. But there's different things happening. There's this sort of physiological change which might be occurring here. But over here there are illnesses, diseases that are affecting people. And there's a concept here that maybe the interventions we need to do need to be at all the time points. This is the life course. So if we're talking about the integrated care for older people, and I don't like the term care, maybe the integrated partnership for older people would be a better term, right? But this is the idea that over here we should be doing things to maintain our intrinsic capacity, and over here we should be dealing with disabling conditions and trying to alter the environment and also the ability what we can do to increase the capacity of individuals who are affected by diseases, and that's a lot of that's rehabilitation. And so there comes, and then at the end they suggest that ensuring a dignified late life, including the final period. So this is the sort of concept that there's a life course approach and there's lots of places to intervene. All right, so I'm going to talk about some research that's been done, and largely this has been done before the World Health Organization did this. So this is a couple of papers from, I'm just going to talk about some things which might help people live healthy aging, achieve healthy aging. And they've been defined in different ways. This is a couple of papers from the nurses cohort study, and they followed nurses from middle age to old age, and they looked at healthy aging as freedom from chronic diseases, no major impairment of cognitive or physical functioning, and good mental health. And what they found is that if you were of normal weight, this sort of lowish weight, this is body mass index, and this is sort of lowish weight, you were more likely to achieve healthy aging. And as people were more likely to be obese or even overweight, in middle age, and let me stress this is in women in their 40s, if you're middle aged, you're obese, you're less likely to get to old age healthily. But what they did find is that physical activity was really beneficial, and it didn't matter, and it was good to have, the best was to have physical activity in midlife and still be doing it in late life. But even if you took it up in late life and you didn't have it in midlife, that was still good. Right? So it seemed to be a benefit no matter when you took it. This is some of my own work, and I like it because some of these things are a little bit counterintuitive. So this is the idea of looking at psychological distress in people from the Melbourne Collaborative Cohort Study. And the Melbourne Collaborative Cohort Study is a study based in Melbourne where about a third of the group are Greek and Italian migrants. And the reason why they did that was they wanted to increase the variability in food, in diet. And what they found was that if you stuck to a Mediterranean diet, you had less psychological distress when you were much older, when you were in your 70s. But the thing that was good about that, the second best diet was the Australian diet, the typical Australian diet. So what's the typical Australian diet? Who can tell me what a typical Australian diet is? Meat, that's correct. Meat, 3 veggies, and fruit and ice cream for dessert. Okay? That is the typical Australian diet. And if you ate that, it was almost as good as the Mediterranean diet. Yeah. Who did badly? The people who did badly were the people who didn't eat these diets. What did they eat? Processed food, takeaway food. So but the point there is it's not just the Mediterranean diet, it's the time you spend buying the stuff, you cook it up, people come together to eat it. All that sort of stuff is really important. It's not just the diet itself, right? That's what you learn. And we found, looking at some other work from that same cohort, we found that fruit was probably pretty good, and limiting meat and fried food, which I'm not very successful at doing, but meat and fried foods aren't particularly good. Now this is another study which I quite like, and this was looking at successful ageing in Melbourne again, and they had worked out the numbers of people you mix with. They actually had at the 50s, when you were in your 50s, they worked out how many people you met in a week. They worked out the number of social contacts in a week. And what we found was that did virtually nothing to successful ageing. So the number of people you met in a week wasn't very important. But what everyone finds is your perception of your social contact. So it's not the number, it's not the size of your social network that's important, right? Size doesn't count. What's important is the perception of the individual, whether that social network is enough. Right? So it's quite a different concept, right? It's not endlessly spending time with people, which would drive me nuts. But it's actually whether you think it's enough. This is a study. This is just looking at the UK and looking at studies, and I just put that in to remind me to say that one of the things that has been found over the years is that cognitive function over the last 25 years in many developed countries has shown that older people have less dementia than they used to, and less cognitive impairment, so that people are living longer, but as far as we can tell, they're not living more years with dementia. They're living longer, and they're living largely a disability-free years are increasing, which is important. In Australia, the evidence is a little bit more mixed, but probably reflects that, but we don't really know about the cognitive impairment story. Now, this is some stuff that we did quite a while ago, actually. This is about almost 10 years old. This is the Men, Women and Ageing study, and this is a study of the Health in Men study. Anybody from the Health in Men? You don't have to volunteer your name now, but so there may be one or two men in the audience who are involved in the Health in Men study. And this is a study that was started in the mid-90s in Perth and looks at older men between the ages of 65 to 80 in 1996. And we looked at them when they were 70 to 75 years of age. And we also got a bunch of women from around Australia, the Australian Longitudinal Study of Women's Health, and we followed those people. And one of the things we did, this is the Health in Men study group. You notice that they were all men, because it's Health in Men, so we're all men, of course. No, it's just by sheer chance, I can assure you. Anyway, so this is our group. And this is what we found about the Health in Men, which is, I'll just explain a bit about it. So the boys are blue and the girls are pink again. And you can see that if you get to be 70 to 75 years of age, that if you are between the body mass index of 25 to 30, you have your lowest risk of dying for 10 years. And it's both for men and women. Do you see? That's men and women. Women die less than men, right? But we both die roughly at around a BMI of 26, which is in the overweight range. If you want to look at somebody with a BMI of about 26, look at moi. So that's my BMI, right? 26, roughly. Little on the plumpish side. Now, if you looked at whether men or women were healthy at the beginning of the study, you can see that healthy men are almost superimposed on unhealthy women, right? See how healthy men but they still, everyone has the best chance of living a long time if their BMI is 26, overweight. And now this is the other really important thing. So we actually thought, well, maybe this could be explained by physical activity. And it didn't explain much, but what we did find was something really interesting. If you were sedentary and you were a man, it increased your mortality risk by 28%. But if you were a woman and you were sedentary, it doubled your mortality risk. So that's a really bad thing. If you're a woman and you're sedentary, it's a really bad thing. Men, on the other hand, might choose to play the risks. It's only 28%, you know. Who knows? Okay. This is a study, this isn't my study, but this is a study that was recently reported where all they did was count the number of steps you do a day, right? Lots of ways of doing that nowadays. And this is a bunch of women, mean age of 72, and they followed them for dying for 4 years. And this is a really important graph. This is, by the time you get to be about 7,000 steps, 7,500 steps, you don't get any benefit. So once you get up to 7,500 steps, quick, grab a seat, because you don't need to do it anymore. But up to then, look at it. Look what happens. 7,500 steps isn't very much. I get past that in a day. It's not very much at all, right? And that's when you plateau. So every extra step decreases your risk of dying. This is, again, other studies which are reassuring. This is to say that your chances of getting dementia are less if you're a little on the overweight side once you're in your 70s. There's no doubt if you're middle age, you need to be normal weight, BMI 20 to 25. But once you're in your 70s, things change. And incident dementia. And if you lose weight, it may not be particularly good for you. This is something else. This is my colleague Osvaldo Almeida. He led some studies I was involved in. This is looking at smoking. Now, smoking is bad. But people often tell you that once you've got to your 70s, well, there's no point in stopping smoking because you've already done all the damage, and it's just going to keep on happening. This is smokers, and this is the parts of the brain that were affected comparing smokers versus non-smokers. And these are exactly the same parts of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's disease. So people who smoke have lower bits of brain in there. And this is a study where my colleague, Professor Almeida, managed to convince some older smokers to stop. And the interesting thing was that their cognition got better, and the parts of the brain, compared to the people who continued to smoke, the parts of the brain got better compared to the ones who continued to smoke. So that suggests that smoking does continue to do you damage, even in your 70s and beyond. This is a study that we worked on with Professor Hankey and others, looking at risk factors once you're in your 70s. And one of the things that we found was once you're in your 70s, low blood pressure seems to be a bigger risk factor than high blood pressure. Yeah. But also, look at this, fair or poor self-reported health. If you feel your health's not particularly good, that's a very bad sign. If you think that your health isn't as good as other people around you, that it's not as good as it used to be, that's a bad thing to happen. That's a bad thing to have. All right. I might leave that one and I'll just go on to this. This is sort of like, I had a Korean observer with me a couple of years ago, and he wrote this paper explaining how the aged care system worked in Australia. And he drew this lovely diagram explaining it. And we have this idea of hospital-based care, an aged care assessment team, non-hospital aged care, community health care packages, community packages here, residential care, transitional care. But we also have this idea of rehabilitation, acute care, rehabilitation. We have outpatient therapy and other clinics. So we have this sort of model of an aged care system. And one of the things, I just mentioned that because one of the things that the World Health Organization was quite clear about was that you just don't put all your money into health promotion, because that's really important. But you actually need to construct the systems around that. And the other thing I haven't talked at all about today was the environment and actually working out age-friendly environments. So one of the really important things, if you're going to encourage participation and activity by older people, you have to make the environments more livable. So that means you don't want cracked pavements that are uneven, which cause people to fall over. You don't want environments where people feel unsafe, where they're accosted in the streets by youths running around and things, unless of course they're your children. But, you know, but the idea that you want to have a sense of safety, and you also want to have a sense that the environment is encouraging your participation. So worldwide ageing, unprecedented, never happened before in history. We've never had this issue, this challenge, if you like. I don't think it's a problem, but we've never had worldwide ageing before, so it's really exciting. We're not quite sure what healthy ageing is, but we're starting to get there. We've got a structure now. It's highly likely that factors affecting healthy ageing will wax and wane in the life course. So it might be better to be normal weight in your middle age. It might be better to be a bit overweight in old age. It might be better to have your blood pressure under strict control in middle age. When you reach your 80s, it may not be so important. So we have to work through some of these issues. And what is also becoming apparent, a combination of lifetime health promoting activities, that's through the life course. So you actually need to be working on people in their 30s and 40s as well if you want them to age healthily, because that's where often physical activity drops off because people are busy doing other stuff. So that might be the time that you want to look at. And you also need targeted services for old people, and that will increase the ability of older Australians to age healthily. And that's it.